Welcome to Bits About Books, the home for conversations with authors of breakthrough books on sales, marketing, and business. Founders, entrepreneurs, and individual professionals, we all need to keep track of ideas that are helping create our today and tomorrow. Bits About Books will strive to find those books and speak to their authors, go behind the scenes and understand what inspired the authors to write the books that they did and how they went about doing so. Through our conversations, we hope to gain insights that will help us to get the most out of our efforts. I'm your host Shubhanjan Sarkar, founder of Pitchlink, the next generation buyer-seller engagement platform where our mission is to make buying easy. Thank you for your time and for joining us in this session. I have a favor to ask. While you continue to listen to the podcast, please leave a comment or rating at iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts from. It means a lot to hear from you. Today, we have with us T.N. Hari, and we will speak about his new bestseller, From Pony to Unicorn, Scaling a Startup Sustainably, which he co-authored with Sanjeev Agarwal, co-founder of Fundamentum, a growth phase VC firm.
And I think there are two ways of building a business. One is right from the go, think about unit economics, think about sustainability. And the other is aim for the stars. If there is a venture capitalist with deep pockets willing to, burn money on your behalf, then you can try out new ideas, try and change consumer behavior. So changing consumer behavior is an expensive affair. It takes a lot of money. And I'm not trying to demean, entrepreneurs and VCs who are burning money to change consumer behavior. Because, I think great ideas take shape only through such daring entrepreneurs and daring venture capitalists. So the nature of the beast is such that some of the ideas don't work out. And, a potential unicorn could just disappear. But having said that, I think, these kind of businesses also have a place. There is an axiom, go big or go home. I am not an advocate of the go home side. I think go big is good because that reflects ambition.
T.N. Hari is an advisor and sounding board to numerous young entrepreneurs and startups. He is also a strategic advisor at Fundamentum, which is a homegrown growth VC fund set up by Nandan Nilekani and Sanjeev Agarwal. Sanjeev is also his co-author for this book. Hari currently heads HR at Big Basket, a grocery unicorn from India. He has studied at both Indian Institute of Technology and the Indian Institute of Management and worked at an executive level with multiple startup scale-ups. He has been through 4 successful exits in different industries: Daksh, Virtusa, Amba Research, and Taxi for Sure. His passion is in scaling organizations through clear thinking and relentless execution. He has co-authored 5 books, including this one. Now, on to this insightful and actionable episode with T.N. Hari. Hari, welcome to Bits About Books again. It's delightful to have you back. I had a rocking time when we spoke last time about Jugaad. And this looks like a very promising and very timely book, From Pony to Unicorn. I think it resonates with every entrepreneur. And you have taken Big Basket. You have been the part of the journey of becoming a unicorn, so you have seen it up close. So tell us, when did you decide to write this book and how did this come about?
So I have co-authored this book with Sanjeev Agarwal. So Sanjeev was the founder of Daksh and I have worked for Daksh as well. So Sanjeev and I go back almost 20 years, since 2000. And both of us have been associated with the startup ecosystems for the last 20 years. And we have seen several startups, take shape, and many of them went on to become unicorns. And at some point of time, both of us felt it would be helpful if we can share some of these lessons with new generation of entrepreneurs who are trying to build sustainable businesses, so that they could potentially, build their businesses without the wheels coming off. So I think we also recognize that 80 to 90% of lessons that entrepreneurs learn are through personal experiences and making mistakes. Only 10 to 15% of lessons are learned by reading the experiences of others and lessons that others share through books. But we felt that even if these 10 to 15%, lessons that entrepreneurs can pick up by reading our book, it would be very helpful for them. So it was just in the interest of these new generation of entrepreneurs being able to scale their startups by avoiding making some mistakes at the key junctures of the journey was the biggest motivation. And we also believe that almost all lessons and insights are pretty easy to understand once you discover them. The point is to discover them. And we thought we could aid the process of discovery by sharing all of these in one place and enable an entrepreneur to read the book and discover some of these insights and lessons.
One very critical point that you make, and which really resonates with me, is the word sustainability. Because a lot of times venture funded businesses have this whole issue that it's very well structured for the venture capital business, but it's not very well structured for entrepreneurship. So I think sustainability, having that as a theme built into this process of going from pony to unicorn, I think is a very required departure from the normal narrative that you see, which is just celebrate somebody who's raising more and more money and has theoretically at least become a unicorn. So you have seen many companies who have theoretically become unicorn and then they vanished, right? So we have seen that. So I think that makes a big difference. So before we get into the book, could you explain why sustainability is really not centered to any thought that is going from pony to unicorn? Why is it like an afterthought most of the time?
Right. So I think to answer that question, one needs to understand how the venture capital business operates. So I think VCs back, ideas which can disrupt the space and, grow gangbusters. And in the process, they have to take some risks. Entrepreneurs have to take some risks. And I think there are two ways of building a business. One is right from the go, think about unit economics, think about sustainability. And the other is aim for the stars. If there is a venture capitalist with deep pockets willing to, burn money on your behalf, then you can try out new ideas, try and change consumer behavior. So changing consumer behavior is an expensive affair. It takes a lot of money. And I'm not trying to demean, entrepreneurs and VCs who are burning money to change consumer behavior. Because, I think great ideas take shape only through such daring entrepreneurs and daring venture capitalists. So the nature of the beast is such that some of the ideas don't work out. And, a potential unicorn could just disappear. For example, you had Snapdeal, which was valued at $6.5 billion at its peak. But I think, I don't know if it's valued more than $1 billion today. Or when it was, being eyed by Flipkart for an acquisition. Take the case of Jabong, for example, right? It was being looked at an acquisition by Amazon potentially at a valuation of $1.2 billion, but eventually was sold off to Flipkart at less than $70 million. ShopClue's unicorn disappeared. But having said that, I think, these kind of businesses also have a place, which is, there is an axiom, go big or go home. I am not an advocate of the go home side. I think go big is good because that reflects ambition. And it's not just about building VC businesses. The go big philosophy works even in the non-profit sector. There could be an entrepreneur who's willing to take a school of 100 students and help educate them better and better. But there could be another entrepreneur who does not want to do this and he wants to take 1 million schools like this and make an impact where hundreds of children in millions of schools get better education. So nothing wrong with either. I think what is wrong was thinking go big or go home. That's the problem. I think go big has a place and, being niche also has a place. So I think eventually whatever you do, ultimately a business has to find an exit in the form of a public market listing. And by the time it reaches the public market, it has to be sustainable. The valuation cannot be on some imaginary metrics. The valuation has to be on some real hard metrics like multiples of revenue or multiples of profitability. A company has to be profitable. So I think the journey can be vague in the sense that a company can build it sustainably right from the beginning till the end, or it can take those big chances where, big VCs are betting big and burning money to create markets where none existed. And then in the process, eventually get to profitability later on. So, and in the process, some may burn out, some may fizzle out. That's all part of the game of startups. Otherwise, there's no fun, no?
Absolutely. Very well said. So let's get back to the book. So when did you sort of decide that, you know what, we need to write a book about going from pony to scale? We have enough experience between the two of us and it's important.
So we thought of this sometime in 2019. And Sanjeev and I also are part of Fundamentum at this point of time. Fundamentum is a growth stage VC fund set up by Sanjeev himself and Nandan Nilekani. So I'm an advisor there. So we keep meeting often. And then at some point, we also realized that both of us have a very similar experience, which is we have seen companies being built for scale. And we've seen several. Sanjeev has seen Make My Trip. He's seen become a unicorn. Daksh itself went on to become a unicorn after an acquisition by IBM and its subsequent sale to Concentrix. I've seen BigBasket. I've seen Virtusa, which is now a $1 billion plus company. It was, it listed in 2007, and today I think it's a $2 billion company. So between us, we have seen several startups scale to unicorns, and we realized that we share some common understanding of how to scale a startup without the wheels coming off. And we thought, since we are also funding several, scale companies, we thought it would be helpful to write this book for the ecosystem.
So it's sort of like you planned it like a manual, so to say?
Yeah, it is a bit of a manual, but it's also got lots of stories, real life experiences. Both are personal experiences as well as what we have seen very closely.
In terms of what all you have touched, I think you have touched on most of the questions that are in the minds of entrepreneurs, things which are either being discussed in media or otherwise. For example, your chapter on US, China and India, it's a very logical, we constantly are comparing, right? How many are coming out of China, what's happening there, what's about their closed ecosystem or open ecosystem and so on and so forth. How did you go about actually structuring the book?
So the way we've structured the book largely is around one central theme, which is we've tried to identify what are the key determinants of scale. And we identified 9 determinants of scale. And we covered all the 9 determinants in chapter 2. And the rest of the book is largely built around many of these 9 determinants of scale. And in the process, we've also talked about US, China, and India, because that's a very relevant theme. Everybody is keen to understand these 3 biggest startup ecosystems in the world. And each of them is unique. Each of them is different from the other. Each of them has its own nuances and individuality. So we thought it's important to compare. And you can't compare an ecosystem unless you go back in history a little bit. Why is the US different from India, is different from China? To understand that, you need to go back in history to see, how the economy and how industry and how innovation evolved in each of these countries. So we've gone back a little bit, tried to put pieces together and try to, draw some conclusions.
My understanding with the limited sort of exposure that I have is that the Indian ecosystem is sort of like a mirror of the US ecosystem, but a few years behind. But the Chinese ecosystem is something which we don't understand very well. What did you find when you went about doing this comparison?
Yeah, so I think the US has a history of innovation, and innovation in India is pretty much a recent affair. So if you look at the US history, it starts from World War I, and after World War II, the US cemented its position as the top country in the world, both in terms of innovation as well as in terms of industry and the economy. So I think they were able to create a magical recipe wherein a liberal culture attracted the best scientists and best engineers of the world. The person who designed the Saturn rockets, which put man on the moon, was designed by a German. And there were so many scientists, from Germany, from Italy, from the rest of the world, who all migrated. A lot of Indian talent also migrated to the US. So I think that liberal culture of the US encouraging innovation. So it became an innovation machine. So the best car companies started in the US. So when the car companies, began stabilizing and, cars were no longer the drivers of the economy, then you had companies like IBM, you had Oracle, you had Intel. And when these companies, peaked out and you needed different innovation, then you had Cisco, then you had, Microsoft. And when they peaked out, you had companies like Amazon, you had Google, Facebook. So it was pretty much as if they had cracked the recipe for innovation. Whereas India, I think, was making a beginning. I think it just opened up in 1991. Until then, it was a completely controlled economy. innovation hardly happened. I think we built some good institutions, political institutions, but we hardly encouraged innovation. I think innovation was completely suppressed. Industry was, not allowed to innovate. Profit was a dirty word. It was only in 1991, after we opened up a little bit, that things began changing. And I think right up to 2000, 2005 almost, the first generation entrepreneurs who had no family business were all who solved an American problem, which is outsourcing. They used the labor arbitrage between India and the West to be able to migrate some work to India. And that was how billion-dollar enterprises, multi-billion-dollar enterprises like Infosys, Wipro, Satyam, whatever, all of these got built. So I think it was only with 2008, with the starting of Flipkart, founding of Flipkart, that Indian entrepreneurs began solving India's problems. India's problems seemed very difficult to solve. There is so much friction on the ground. There is so poor infrastructure that nobody was enthused to solve India's problems. But I think 2008 was a confluence. A lot of things came together. VCs came together. Entrepreneur founders came together. Mentors in the ecosystem came together. Everyone realized that, after China, it is going to be India. So the big picture that India is going to be the next big happening country, purely by macroeconomic indicators, made everyone come towards India. And I think that actually was the boost that gave India a push. So you see, after 2008, I think it became pretty cool to become an entrepreneur. Hundreds of entrepreneurs, if not thousands of them, are doing interesting things which nobody would have ever dreamt of before. The founders of Flipkart, I think, inspired thousands of others to take up entrepreneurship. If you go to campuses today on day 0 or day 1, you find startups finding a place. So I think India is evolving rapidly, but I think there is going to be still a lot of friction on the ground. The infrastructure isn't very great. Although we are fixing the electronic infrastructure in the form of Aadhaar, payment, systems are all becoming probably the best in the world. But the physical infrastructure on the ground is still creaky. We don't know if it will ever be completely solved. And China, on the other hand, is completely different animal altogether. It's not a liberal and a free society. So they've taken a completely different approach of almost imposing innovation and imposing economic growth by putting in some of these measures.
It's time for a short break. The very second chapter in the book, Hari and Sanjeev defines the 9 determinants of scale. I asked Hari what they were and how they impact the making of an unicorn. To find out about the MMFFSSCCH formula, stay with us.
You are listening to a Business Podcast Network original. Podcasting is the fastest growing content marketing opportunity which is untapped. We can help you craft your audio strategy and help leverage the wide reach and easy streaming capability that the smartphone penetration provides. It is easy, it is powerful and personal. Talk to us to find out how podcasting can help you build your brand and reach out to your targets like never before. Write to us at bpn@bizcast.in. That is bpn@bizcast.in. Business Podcast Network. Podcasts end to end.
Welcome back. I'm Shubhanjan Sarkar, your host for Bits About Books and founder of PitchLink. As we went into the break, I asked Hari to elaborate on the MMFFSSCCH formula, the 9 principal determinants of an unicorn. Let us dive right in with Hari and discover what factors make unicorns. Let's go back to chapter 2 and let's touch upon those 9 points that you find is a common thread between the unicorns that you have seen yourself. So tell us about those 9 points that you elaborate on later.
So the first point is about you need to be part of a mega trend if you wish to be a large player, if you wish to end up as a large company. And a mega trend is, for example, urban transportation is a mega trend, which is that urban transportation in most parts of the world is broke. Getting a cab on demand was impossible, and it was a big problem. So the mega trend was using technology to make cabs and vehicles available on demand. So whether it was a mega trend that was exploited by Uber or whether Uber ended up creating a mega trend for others to then exploit is a debatable point. but then you need to be part of a mega trend. So another big mega trend could be that India's middle, of the pyramid is emerging and is seeing a tryst with destiny. So those entrepreneurs who can figure out how to solve the problems of 400 million Indians is probably going to end up as a winner. So it's important to be able to play in the mega trend space. You need to be, part of a large mega trend. The second parameter was the market opportunity must be big. It has to be really big, because otherwise you will end up with a small market share of a medium or small market, and then you can never become a big company. So you need to play in a large market. So if a market is $10 billion, and if you have a 5% share, which is $500 million is your revenue, and if you get a multiple of 2 on that, you become a unicorn. So you need to play in a very large market. So if you take any company which has scaled and grown, whether it's a Swiggy or a Big Basket or a Make My Trip or a Flipkart, they've all played in these large markets. The third is, founder ambition. Founders need to be ambitious to be able to play, because if there's a mega trend and if there's a large market, it will attract very big players. It will attract global gorillas. So to be able to fight those global gorillas, you need to be ambitious. And ambition can reflect in different ways. Ambition can be reflect in being personally, solving problems and demonstrating hustle, or it could be about creating the right organization structure, hiring the right people, and then empowering and delegating things to them. So ambition could reflect in many ways, but ultimately ambition comes to play when you are in a near-death situation or when you are facing a real challenge. That's when true ambition comes to the fore. So ambition is very critical. And if you see all successful startups, I think whether it is Zomato or Swiggy or a Big Basket or a Make My Trip, all of them demonstrated tremendous, ambition. Ola raced neck to neck with Uber, and they could do that only because of founder ambition. Big Basket was able to play in a space that was dominated by, Amazon and several other players, only because it was, the founders were clear about what to do, clarity as well as ambition. The next one is called foundation. So I would call it MMFF. The second F is foundation, which is you cannot scale without creating the right foundation. You might scale for short periods of time without a foundation, but that scale will be, false, it will be fake, and it will come off any moment. So it's important to be able to create the right kind of foundation as you go along. And the foundation could be as simple as putting in place a policy for preventing harassment. It could be about getting the right technology so that you don't incur huge technology debt, or you don't kill your company through Excel sheets. So it could be about many things, putting the right processes in place. So it could be about getting all of these in place and creating the right foundation for scale. The next is the 2 C's, which is culture and customer centricity. So culture is very critical. Culture, if you don't create the right kind of culture, it's unlikely that you can scale. The wheels will come off for some time or the other. For example, all the rocket internet companies in India, whether it was Food Panda or Jabong, actually, fell by the wayside, and Rocket exited India completely. And all their companies had a problem with foundation as well as culture. They could not create the right culture. All of them tried to take shortcuts. There were integrity issues, violating the law and many other problems. So I think it's important, to create the right culture. And culture, there are 3 types of companies. I think it's important to make this point. The first company is a company that has no clue what culture is. How can they make culture work for them? And why is culture such a strategic advantage? They have no clue. The second company has an intuitive understanding of what culture is. They know how to make it work for them. And they don't go about tom-tomming their culture a great deal. The third category of companies are those who tom-tom their culture and create a cult out of that culture. It could include companies like Zappos. I think, the first company is going to struggle. The third company also will struggle because they are not inclusive. By creating a cult, they are excluding a good number of people. And they are creating, visible indicators or artifacts as a reflection of culture. So artifacts could mean, your dress code. It could mean office getup. It could mean celebratory styles. Those are not, elements of culture at all. Culture is the unspoken stuff. It is the invisible hand, the kind of people that are recognized and rewarded. All of those things really is culture. So the second type of companies truly get it. The first and third categories don't get it, I think. Then coming to customer centricity, I think it's pretty obvious that customer centricity is a leading indicator of all other business metrics like growth or revenue or profitability. It is so obvious that you don't even need to say this. But the point is that most people, just pay lip service to customer experience. The test is when the rubber hits the road, when you have to make some of these difficult trade-offs. That's when many companies don't make those difficult trade-offs. And to be customer centric, I think you need to make those trade-offs in favor of customer centricity. The next, because you don't get customer centricity right, you are never going to get the product market fit right either. So we talked of MM, we talked of CC, we talked of FF. Next are the two S's, which is getting the strategic choices right. If you get a few strategic choices right, then you're pretty much all set. You can actually cover up some of your other mistakes. So for example, BigBasket chose to go down the path of an inventory-led, model, as opposed to a marketplace model, because we realized that in grocery, customers shop with us because they wanted to avoid a visit to the store. And you can't tell a customer if you order 25 items, they'll give you 24. But for the one item, you need to visit the store, because then they would visit a store for the remaining 24 also. So then we realized that you need to get your inventory right. So we went for the inventory-led model. And almost every company that went by the marketplace model actually fell by the wayside. Although that was more easily scalable, it fell by the wayside. The next is strategic execution. So strategic execution is a lot about, getting a lot of invisible pieces together and to dovetail in such a manner that others can't imitate or can't even make out that you are having an advantage. So one of the BigBasket's biggest advantage is, you just think about it. We deliver millions of orders and creating the same kind of customer experience every time. You can create a customer experience for 10 situations, 10 orders, but you can't do that millions of times unless you get different pieces together very well. And those different pieces are process, technology, training. All of these you need to get together in such a seamless way that it creates a great customer experience that cannot be imitated or copied by anybody else, because those pieces dovetail in a manner that is difficult for an outsider to figure out. How do you get this right on scale? So that's about the two S's. And the last one is about human capital, which is how do you get all these human capital programs right? The most complex of all the 9 is the human capital issues, because there are too many nuances, and most of the lessons in the human capital side, the lessons are learned through experience. So they are experiential. It's not very easy to read a book and understand how to deal with all of these human capital nuances. And it's extremely complex. So we've devoted significant space to most of these 9 ingredients.
How do you, when there are literally thousands of companies trying to scale, how do you find the right talent at the leadership level and the levels down? It's a significant challenge for especially countries like India, where the ecosystem is still evolving, and you really don't have that kind of experienced people available in the ecosystem who have worked in companies like these. So how do you sort of mitigate that risk? How do you overcome this challenge?
So I will use a physics terminology as an analogy. When people come into an organization, they need to be able to resonate. And resonance happens only when the frequencies match. So, and it's about the frequency of the culture of the company and the individual's personality. There has to be a match. And the point I've always made is that, therefore, one company's strategy for talent cannot be the same as another company's strategy for talent. So, for example, I worked for 2 organizations, Daksh and BigBasket. Both were absolutely amazing companies. Both were best in class, but their approach to talent has been very different. So Daksh actually picked people who were extremely aggressive, who were from the best engineering and business schools, who were very articulate, who communicated well, who could take decisions independently, and were pretty much assertive. Whereas BigBasket chose a completely different approach. We chose people who could punch above their weight class. We never fired people for non-performance. We gave multiple chances. Whereas Daksh, there were not too many chances. You could not hide for too long easily. At BigBasket, we never chose to go to some of the top schools. We never went to the best B schools or the best this thing, because we believe that if you can pick average people or reasonably smart people and back them up with strong processes, you can get outstanding customer experience. And the reason why we picked this strategy also had to do with our businesses. So Daksh was a high margin business. So you could afford to pick a people strategy which could, capitalize on that availability of that margin, which is that you could pick expensive people who could grow your business rapidly. Whereas Big Basket was a low margin business, a grocery business. And therefore, our people strategy also had to match. So we could not afford to go to the best B schools and pick very expensive people. So we preferred to pick smart people who did not necessarily have the stamp of an Ivy League education.
So does this flow from the founders, or is it dependent upon somebody like you with deep understanding of the human side and to come into the organization? What if Big Basket, for example, didn't hire you or you didn't join them? What would have happened to this whole nuance that you are talking of?
Nothing would have happened. I think it all flows from the founders.
Okay.
It is, I think the HR head only facilitates whatever is the culture of the company and becomes a bit of an upholder. But the determinant of a culture pretty much are founders.
So that brings me to the culture bit. Both HR and people capital, human capital, and of course, culture is sort of part of that, I guess. These are really soft ideas, right? It's not like, okay, this is a market size, this is my cost of acquisition of customer, and so on. It's not easy to quantify or easy to sort of put a box around it to make it or break it down and say, okay, this is my culture. This is my culture matrix, right?
Yes.
And which is why so many people get it wrong, because it's not easy to understand. Right?
Correct.
And which is why that third kind of company you mentioned, where you try to do, okay, this is our celebrations kind, or this is how you you put up a name of the employee of the month and so on, and you think that that's culture and so on.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, from your deep understanding of this space, what is the way to approach it?
So to answer this question, Subhanjan, culture is somewhat like an individual's personality. All individuals have a unique personality. Similarly, companies have a unique culture. You will remain who you are. For example, you could be very good at problem solving. You may have deep analytical skills. You may hate to go and meet strangers and sell stuff to them. And that in some ways is your personality. You could be an introvert. You would prefer to read a book rather than go out and meet a stranger. So you have a personality, and you are not going to change that personality for life. Although you might tweak some aspects of your personality and become a little more rounded, you will largely remain who you are. Similarly, companies also have a personality, and that personality in the beginning is driven by the personality of the founders. Over a period of time, I think as different people at senior level get recruited laterally, some of them come from different backgrounds, some bit of amalgamation happens, and the company begins to discover that what really represents us. There is an exchange of ideas, there is an exchange of values. The fundamentals pretty much will remain the same, because the selection process for even the lateral hires largely ensures that they are adherents to the original culture of the company, but they may bring in some new dimensions which may get amalgamated. So the culture of the company can change a little bit, but it will remain what it is largely. And to answer your other question, I think it's not very difficult to determine what the culture of a company is. For example, if you ask me about Big Basket, I would say a few things like humility, for example, right? Understated, completely understated. No aggression when it comes to laying off people. We will hold people. Underperformers are not thrown out. They are given a few other chances. And there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of support, more of collective goals. If you are not able to meet your goals, somebody else will come in and help you. Individuals don't get a lot of credit. Teams may get more credit. So that defines Big Basket culture. At Daksh, for example, it was a very aggressive workplace. If you didn't perform, if you didn't deliver goals, you are not going to get too much of support, because people are busy doing their own stuff. You either perform or you perish. There's not too much of support going to come about. And very high quality communication, whereas here the communication is not important. It is not considered important. So, culture can be very easily defined that way.
I'm sure it's clear in your mind, but you see so many companies going wrong on that count, right? Because of the lack of clarity. I hope that the book helps them get that. So I'll touch upon two more points and we'll wrap this up. One is about valuation and capitalization, the chapter that you've written on. And that's a sort of again, a tricky thing, right? So the discourse is that if end of it, you're a unicorn, but you either are not able to encash it, or you are not able to, or you are reduced to like 1% of the company by the time you become a unicorn. What is your motivation level as a entrepreneur? And obviously that's one point. Valuation is one point where potential conflict of interest remains between the investor and an entrepreneur. So unless it's done right, what thoughts have you sort of shared in the book on that count?
See, I think one should never really, as a founder, look at what is going to be my value. How much will I make out of this, and therefore the way I build the business will depend on that. I think each business is amenable to be built in a certain way. So, for example, some businesses are cash guzzlers. They will require a lot more capital than some other businesses, and therefore the founders have to necessarily dilute. For example, Amazon is a cash guzzler. Flipkart guzzled a lot of cash. Swiggy is guzzling a lot of cash. Ola guzzled a lot of cash. A founder of Ola cannot say, I want to hold 50% of Ola and still build a $10 billion company. It's not possible to do that, because if you want to do that, you will need a lot of capital, and capital won't come to you, without them getting their stake. So I think, a founder can also look at it as, do I hold a 1% stake in a $1 billion, in a $10 billion company? Or do I own a 50% stake in a $20 million company? So holding a 1% stake in a $10 billion company will make you far more money than holding a 50% stake in a $50 million company, for instance.
Sure.
So I think there are multiple ways of skinning the cat. And the only way I think a founder should look at it is, what is the nature of business I'm building, and what kind of capital will this require? So if you're building a business which relies on changing consumer behavior and building a large market which is going to consume a lot of capital, it is inevitable that you will dilute. And you shouldn't worry about that, because you're building an institution. You still control the company. You're still running the company. So how does it really matter? That's the way I would see it.
So the counter is that if you get reduced beyond a point, your ability to actually control the company and continue to run it becomes suspect, and that's also pretty much part of the reality of when VCs basically can take over and just remove you. So that it's a tricky thing. But okay, that was not my point. I was just wanting to understand how you touched upon it over in the book. So the final one is about build to sell or build to last. Let's hear about what your thoughts are on that, and how have you sort of projected those thoughts into the book.
So I think some companies clearly are built to sell, but most other companies, I think when they are built, one does not realize whether they are built to sell or built to last, because eventually, just 1% of startups go on to become unicorns. Less than 50% of startups which raise one round of funding go on to do the next round of funding. So it's very, very uncertain in the beginning whether a company will be sold or will it emerge as an institution that outlasts the founders. That's very difficult to predict. But some businesses clearly are built to sell. For example, the way a founder looks at a build to sell business is not, a case of what is my passion and what problems should I be solving. That's not the way a build to sell founder would look at a business. The build to sell founder would look at it like, which is an attractive market? And in that market, for example, if there is a big player and that big player does not have the time to build a niche or adjacent segment, if I build it quickly under the radar, I could potentially be acquired. So for example, if Amazon does not have the time to build a daily milk delivery business or a daily, grocery business, then for example, a milk basket, might as well think of, if I build this business very quickly, someday Amazon has to necessarily enter the space, and I would have been able to build an asset that is attractive for them. So I think a founder that's looking at build to sell will always look at what are the markets which are attractive, where there are big gorillas who don't have the time to enter that niche because it's too small at that point of time, but someday will become important. Why don't I enter that space and build it in such a way that it becomes attractive? So that's the way, people who are building businesses to sell would go about it.
And how does that sort of connect to the idea of going from pony to unicorn. So the people who are building to sell are not necessarily trying to build a unicorn. Is that
correct? That's correct. Because they're not necessarily trying to build lasting companies or institutions that outlive their founders. They are being very opportunistic. And that's perfectly all right, because there should be everyone in this world. Otherwise, that niche also needs to be addressed. If Amazon does not have the time to build out that niche, somebody needs to do that. And ultimately, a free society, a capitalist society relies on these individual motivations to be able to do all the right things.
Right. So finally, you end this book with 10 good habits. And why did you want to write that? And how does it what does it say?
I think this is really saying that, every company that wants to scale should develop some good habits which are universally helpful. So, for example, being frugal is universally helpful. Developing good habits in good times and not waiting for bad times to hit you to develop good habits is a universally good thing to do. Not getting sucked into activity traps and doing only things that matter, and therefore, being able to prioritize focus is a good habit. So we just felt that if entrepreneurs can develop some good habits, they're very essential. You must have heard of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Ultimately, it is these habits which determine one's success in life. Stephen Covey's 3 habits of being an independent professional, being successful in an interdependent world. He's got 3 more habits. And each of these 6 and 1 more is there separately. 7 habits are so beautiful that if you live these habits every day, you have to be successful. He says you need to be proactive. Proactive means you never blame the world for your problems. You think of what can I do? What's in my sphere of influence? Such a powerful habit. So similarly, we thought, startups also, if they understand what are some universally good habits and display those every day, have a good chance for being successful as companies.
Bits About Books is brought to you by PitchLink, the buyer-seller engagement platform. PitchLink makes buying easy by enabling high-quality engagement between buyers and sellers through its presentation and discussion modules. Sellers create customized sales narratives using sales collaterals and personal videos and reach out to prospects through a non-intrusive, buyer-qualified engagement. PitchLink requires no installation or download and holds the entire repository of sales collaterals and buyer-seller conversations. Talk to us to know more about how you can engage with customers without intrusion. Call us on 99021 631 32.
Wonderful. Hari, thank you so much. And I'm really glad we had this chat, and I'm sure people who read the book will take a lot out of it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time and for joining us in Bits About Books.
Thank you, Subhanjan. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have a fantastic lineup over the next couple of episodes and great conversations on breakthrough books. Subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you do not miss a single episode. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for being with us today on Bits About Books, where we talk to authors about breakthrough books on sales, marketing, and business. We hope this conversation helped inform and motivate as we all navigate a rapidly changing business environment. For us, these are enlightening conversations enriched with knowledge and expertise. We encourage you to go out and buy the book to learn firsthand and implement some of the great ideas we discussed today. We hope to have you with us again in the next exciting episode of Bits About Books. If you liked what you heard, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast platforms like iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, and give us a rating while you are at it.
This Bizcast original podcast is produced for PitchLink, the next generation buyer-seller engagement platform, where the mission is to make buying easy. Hosted by Subhanjan Sarkar and produced by Rajiv Aditya. See you next time and have a wonderful day.